Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and it's great to be here with you at Glastonbury. As Hugh told you, unfortunately Chris can't be here. It's due to a problem with Spain and grandchildren, so we won't go into it any further than that. But I do notice, looking at my first slide, that it's probably just as well that he's not here, because as you will see, I've managed to split my name into two. Now, Chris is definitely the artistic one in our partnership. And last time I made a slideshow for a talk, he said, Alan, that's not megalithic. He said, that's Neanderthal. So you'll just have to make do with the slides as I've put them together, but I'm sure they'll all make sense. Now then, I'm going to see if by the magic of... oh, look at that. Incredible. Okay, so this is the book. Why is it... Never mind, this will do for starters. I'm talking to you tonight about our book, Before the Pyramids. But it's important, I think, that before I do, because some of you will have not read our books and don't know what our information is about, that I go back a little bit and give you a brief resume of where we're coming from in the first place. And this, therefore, is the first slide and the most important slide with regard to our common research. Just over 20 years ago, I decided to take a holiday in Crete, in Greece. I had an ulterior motive for wanting to be there because I'd been interested for a long time in the Minoan civilization. Now, the Minoans flourished in Crete until probably around about 1400, 1450 BC. They are renowned as being Europe's first super civilization. They had a wonderful civilization. They were great sailors, great traders, a very peaceful civilization. So it seems they had no major standing army. They had a very good navy. They could defend against piracy and so forth. But generally speaking, it was a very equitable and very feminine-led sort of society. Now, one of the things that interested me most about the Minoans was their ability to count. I knew before I went to Crete that they had their own measuring systems, their own weight systems, and their own accountancy systems, because, of course, they were great traders. And one of the devices I was most interested in was what you can see on the screen before you now. It's called a Phaistos disc. It was found in the ruins of a palace, the Palace of Phaistos on the south of Crete, at the beginning of the 20th century. It dates back to an estimated 2000 BC. It's a double-sided disc, about 5.5 inches across, and on both sides of the disc is a spiral which is incised into the disc. Within the spiral, in both cases, there are hieroglyphics which are set within groups. Before I even went to Crete, I had an idea exactly what this disc might do. I was able to go and see the real one in Heraclean Museum and research during my period there, and subsequently bore out what I already believed. Now, we don't know what the disc says because the hieroglyphics obviously represent the Minoan language. We don't know what language they spoke, so these hieroglyphs have never been deciphered. It wasn't so much an interest to me to know what the disc said as what it could do, because if we take each hieroglyph within each group representing one digit, it turns out that the Phaistos disc is a wonderful multifunctioning machine which can do all sorts of wonderful tricks as far as the sky is concerned. It can, for example, predict the position in the zodiac of the Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus at any time on any day ever in a very, very simple way. But my first idea about the disc is that it must have been associated with a calendar. I took this to be the case because on one side of the disc there are 30 groups. On the other side of the disc there are 31 groups. And I hypothesized that maybe this represented 2 months of a calendar which alternated between 30 and 31 days for each month. And straight away that led me to believe just maybe the Minoans celebrated a year of 366 days. That might seem a little bit odd to us, but it's not really. We live on an earth which unfortunately, in terms of its or orbit around the sun does not have an even number of days. The solar year is 365.2564 days, which is damned inconvenient if you happen to be a farmer. So we have to do one of two things. We either have to have a year of 365 days and compensate by adding days every so often, or 366 days and removing days every so often. And I came to understand, and it's a long and complicated explanation, which is not actually part of this talk, that what they had done was they had devised a secondary calendar which had units of 123 days, which are indicated on side A of the disc. And after 4 times 123 days, which is 492 days, they removed 1 day from the ritual 366-day calendar, and that meant that their calendar would remain accurate with the solar calendar for 10,000 years without any other correction having to be made. This is absolutely stupendous and is far, far better than the system we're using now when we're working in the opposite direction. So, they were able to resolve their dilemma over the 366-day year, and I was able to say with some certainty that I hit upon something very significant, because no other culture until that point in time had ever used this sort of calendar as far as we knew. If we move on to the next slide, which is that one, hooray, it works. I took the information that I already had about the face dust disc, and I looked at the Minoan way of measuring distance. A Canadian archaeologist by the name of J. Walter Graham had discovered that the Minoans used a linear unit which was 30.365 centimetres in length, very close to the modern statute foot, but just very slightly different. He'd come to this conclusion because of the measurements he'd taken on all the known Minoan palaces and other buildings. There was a little bit of criticism at first. People said it may be true, or you may just be making something up that just happens to fit. But then a few years after, another palace was found at Zakro, which hadn't been discovered before, and lo and behold, his measurements fitted. So now everybody is pretty sure that the Minoan foot was 30.365 centimetres in length. I wanted to know if this meshed with any other measuring system, ancient measuring system, which we knew about in Europe, but they are very few and far between. The only one which I already knew about was the Megalithic Yard, which was rediscovered by Professor Alexander Thom, who I'll mention more specifically in a moment. And he said that the Megalithic Yard, which he claimed had been used in most of the megalithic structures throughout Britain and in Brittany, was 82.966 centimetres in length, or 2.722 feet. And very quickly I came to discover that 1,000 Minoan feet is exactly the same as 366 megalithic yards. And it's so exactly the same that it's a mark of respect to J. Walter Graham, Alexander Thom, and to the people who designed these units in the first place. And what it told me was there was likely to be a very definite connection between those two units. So it's two different ways of measuring the same linear length. Now, I mentioned a minute ago Alexander Thom. That's him. Alexander Thom was born towards the end of the 19th century. He grew to become a professor of engineering at Oxford University. On the way, he was fascinated by astronomy and also by archaeology. He was a Scot, and because of that, he was particularly interested in the megalithic monuments in Scotland, especially the early circles. And he had a hunch that the stone circles in Scotland had been built to track the tortuous position of the moon across its long periods. And he wanted to prove this to himself. And so he set himself a task which became a lifetime task to survey carefully and to measure extremely carefully every megalithic structure that he could find. And he was doing this for 55 years in almost every spare moment that he had. All the famous structures were measured, and he even carried on down and did